Hello, my name is Emily, and today I'm going to discuss the history and background of the Antiquities Act of 1906. First, we are going to begin with a bit of background. The purpose of the Antiquities Act of 1906 is to allow the President to authorize and proclaim national monuments on federal land that have historic landmarks, historic or prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest. However, with all this power, there are still some limitations. For example, Congress must authorize any monument in Wyoming and any monument in Alaska greater than 5,000 acres. We'll get into why that is later on. Also, the monument must meet an extensive already established criteria. The importance and the intent of this law begin with the fact that it is the first law ever established like it. It was made to protect federal lands and resources quickly. It is the very basis of protecting U.S. historical sites and archaeology. And lastly, it holds the federal government accountable for federal lands. Next, we will discuss the history of the Antiquities Act of 1906. The ruins and dwellings of prehistoric men in the American West had always sparked the curiosity of many. However, it was not until after the Civil War that Eastern scientific community actually had time to care or research even further. For many historians, 1879 marks the beginnings of this act. This was the result of several vandalism attempts or failed archaeology sites. However, it was not until 1882 that Senator George F. Orr first proposed Antiquities Acts, but it failed. Later, in 1889, a proposal for Casa Grande archaeological preservation was made, and it actually passed. It took several more years and several more failed attempts. However, in 1906, Senator John F. Lacey sponsored one of 4 Antiquities Acts presented in the Roosevelt administration, and it was Senator Lacey's sponsored Antiquities Bill that President Theodore Roosevelt signed into law on June 8, 1906. Many described it as the cornerstone of American preservation and conservation law. In the same year, President Roosevelt created the first national monument called the Devil's Monument in Wyoming. Then, from 1906 to 2018, between 17 presidents, 158 monuments have been created and or extended. Monuments such as the Grand Canyon or Grand Teton and so on. Interestingly, FDR used his authority the most, using it a whopping 36 times, while recent President Obama proclaimed the greatest amount of acreage while in office, nearly 554 million acres, most of which were primarily marine expansion monuments. Diving further into history, there has never been any official amendments, but there have been attempts to amend this law and other statutes that have applied to assist with problems such as those faced during FDR and Carter's administration. Leading to FDR and Carter's administration led to congressional approval for monuments in Wyoming and Alaska, as previously talked about. The Clinton administration also triggered several lawsuits, but it never resulted in an amendment of the law, but rather resulted in more statutes being developed to assist this law. In continuing, some of the other points of contention are the fear that this law gives a president too much power to simply modify the size, type of protected resource, not to mention determine the level of threat to an area, the inclusion of federal land within a monument boundaries, the selection of the management agency for the land, the restriction on the land use, and lastly, the lack of congressional or state approval for each and every state. Many believe that the solution could be to limit presidential power, and yet others are still for the Antiquities Act as it is, and believe it has done and is doing great things for the U.S. history and natural resources alike. It is crazy to think that this act, that is barely a page in length, has made such a major impact. In closing, here is the full act, or the Antiquities Act of 1906, which you can read later if you would like. Additionally, here are my resources that can help you dive further into the Antiquities Act of 1906. Thank you for listening.